and through some wild weather managed to arrive yesterday to talk to us as part of STEM Live. So please welcome Professor Louise Archer.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk with you about our research. So just to start off and put it in context, why do we need to improve young people's relationship with STEM? We think we do. Obviously, there's the quite well-known STEM participation crisis, the idea that we don't have enough young people qualified in STEM to fill the current gaps and the future gaps which are predicted to grow. And the gap is seen as very important for national economic prosperity, and we recognise that and support that, but we're also concerned that there are inequalities within that in terms of who is doing STEM. So particularly in the physical sciences and engineering, we have a really chronic underrepresentation of women, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and some minority ethnic groups. So we see that as an injustice that deserves to be looked at. But also looking to the future, we think that STEM is really important for active citizenship. So we think it's important for everyone, every young person, not just those who are thinking of a STEM career in the future. Now, we're all aware that lots and lots of time and money has been put into trying to address this over the years. And there's not been a lot of change in the overall participation rates. A lot of initiatives have focused on trying to make science more fun. So fun is good, we're definitely not against fun. But our research suggests that that's not the whole picture, and it's probably not necessarily the key issue that that needs tackling. So the project I'm going to talk about mainly today is the Aspires study. So this is a 10-year research project that we've had. We've been following the same cohort of young people from the age of 10 up to 18. They're all about 19 now. We picked them up at the end of primary school in England, which is our year 6. When they're aged 10, 11, and we do large-scale surveys, so we've surveyed over 40,000 young people to date, and then we also have done long-term, longitudinal qualitative interviews with children and their parents. And as you'll see there at age 18, 19, we've managed to keep 61 young people and their parents in that sample. So together, this data gives us a really nice picture as they're going along in their lives of how young people make decisions around STEM. And I thought I'd just start by setting it in context of what do young people aspire to? So this is a slightly overcomplicated graph, but it's trying to show at different time points, the different coloured columns relate to different times, what the picture is with different aspirations. So you'll see the first column up there is business. And you can see that's quite high and quite stable over time. We didn't ask every question every year, which is why some columns look a bit lonely, like technology. You can see in there that celebrity is perhaps a little depressingly high and stable, we could say. And then we've got qualification areas like sports, which have quite a big drop-off over time, as young people come to realise not everyone's going to be a professional footballer. But the next slide I'll show you just sort of simplifies this a bit for some of the key trends that we want to pull out. So this is just our students aged 15, 16 who are at the end of the compulsory schooling. And you can see there, business, really strong and high, scientist in red there, a little bit languishing at the end. Now, I always say we have to have a bit of a health warning with this slide, because obviously what you call business can completely vary. So wanting to aspire to business can be being, CEO of Google. It could be running your own mobile hairdressing salon. So there is a lot of leeway in there. But the thing that we find interesting about this is if you break down and look at who it is who's aspiring to business, it's the most equitable aspiration in terms of it has the best class, gender, and ethnic mix of students in it. Whereas if you look at science and engineering, you'll find it's statistically much more likely to be white and South Asian middle-class boys. So there's something about business that allows young people to imagine themselves into it in a way that's not happening for some of the other STEM areas. So we're interested in what makes that happen. Some of the issue with business could be what we call the Alan Sugar effect, the idea of from the show The Apprentice, that it's not about paperwork and qualifications, it's about meritocracy, it's about really wanting it. So there could be some of that science, but science doesn't have those sort of opening discourses. So we're interested in how can we shift that. This slide is also showing that the reasons that people aspire to things are perhaps not exactly as we've imagined. So this shows with the different coloured bars that it's not that lack of interest in science is the thing that's driving that little low bar on the previous slide. So you can see there over time that most students in England say they learn interesting things in science. So you can see it's up around 70% at the end of our primary and into early secondary. The purple bar is just before the national examinations at age 16, when I would argue it's really hard to keep interest in any subject because it's a lot of teaching to the test. So I'd say, on the whole, our teachers are doing a good job. They're making science lessons interesting. The greyed out colour bar at the end of Learn Interesting Things is only students who do science A-level, and luckily most of them are finding it really interesting. It's also not that their parents have negative views of science. So again, this is an example item, but parents think it's important for me to learn science. So up until the end of compulsory schooling, when all students have to study science in England, it's very high. There's an interesting drop-off once science is no longer compulsory, which I think is an interesting thing for policy to think about the messages we send about what's compulsory and what's not. But it's also not that young people have really, really negative views of scientists. So, and again, an example item is that third grouping, which is young people think scientists do valuable work. They also think they make a positive difference in the world. They think that scientists earn a lot of money, which is something that not all scientists thoroughly agree with, but they have generally positive views. But as you can see, altogether, these notions of science being interesting, having parental support, thinking, good views of scientists, don't translate into the fourth set of columns there, which is your aspirations to continue with it as a career in the future. So we call this the being-doing divide, the idea that I like doing science at school, I find it interesting, I just don't want to be a scientist in the future. So we're interested in what creates this gap. And that little bunch of bars at the bottom for aspiring to be a scientist, there is no statistical change between those, and we were quite struck by that from the age of 10 to 18, there is no statistical change in that level, which we were expecting a lot more change between, surely at the age of 10, the world should be your oyster. So what shapes these patterns? Our work, unsurprisingly, says it's all very complex. We are sociologists, so that is always the answer. Any funders in the room, the other answer is more research is needed. But I really want to show this slide because I'm going to focus on the last one of those in detail, Science Capital. But first, I just want to put those in context. So part of one of our messages is it is the whole system working together. It's not just about changing the young people, it's also about understanding the context around them. So the only one I'm not going to talk about is our friend Sheldon there in media representations, which I've meanly called the Sheldon effect. So the first one is schools, teachers and the education system. And I think we've been quite struck by the research which shows that still we find differential gendered expectations, unwitting stereotypes around who goes into science or particularly into physics and engineering. So there's a little quote there. So one of the girls from an independent, very pro-science girls' school in our study who said, my teacher told me you need to have a boy brain to study physics. So they slip in there. Heidi Carlone's research also talks about from the States how she looked at an advanced level physics class and the girls were outperforming the boys, but when she talked to the staff, the teacher was saying, well, the boys have got a natural raw talent, they're just lazy, the girls work really hard. And sometimes these sort of unwitting gendered stereotypes can be very powerful and get conveyed. We obviously know there are issues around teacher supply, retention and specialism. And also in England, partly to make you feel better about the Scottish system, we do things really badly in terms of the idea of trying to keep young people in science. We basically try and stream them out at the age of 12 or 13 and make it really difficult to continue with science, really hard to get onto A-level science, and when you're there, we mark A-level physics harder than every other subject. So we do a range of very confusing practices which perhaps work against widening participation. And we also have a culture of early specialisation, which we think is quite difficult for encouraging a broad range of people to continue. And I'm just going to note careers education as well, that again, it's part of that backdrop where we've had cuts in provision, and although it's meant to reach every student, our research suggests it's not reaching every student by the age of 16. For example, 63% self-report they've not had careers education. There could be an argument, maybe they've had it and they don't recognise it, but they don't feel they've had it. And our research shows that those who could benefit most from it, or perhaps most in need, are the least likely to receive it or to access it. And we think that's partly because we have a self-referral model, which relies on there being a service, which you self-refer, you make your own appointment. And this plays out differently across social inequalities. So basically we're saying there's often too little, too late careers education. And also we have the issue of whether young people feel they're getting impartial careers education, which is difficult if schools have the requirement to provide it. And if you've got a sixth form, post-16 offer, there's an impetus to encourage people that way. So having set the context, which is mainly to say science capital is important, but it works within this bigger system as well. We developed the concept of science capital in the Aspires project and have extended it since. And we found it really useful for providing a way to bring together and understand the patterns we were seeing. So in a nutshell, science capital refers to all the science-related resources that you might have. We like to use a metaphor, so here we've used a bag. The idea that your science capital bag is all your science-related knowledge, contacts, interests, or anything science-related that you have. When we've done national surveys in England, we've found that about 5% of 11 to 15-year-olds have high science capital, and about 27% have low science capital, which we say is quite a large proportion. And our findings statistically show that the more science capital you have, you're more likely to both aspire to continue with science in the future, but also, importantly for us, to see yourself as a science person, irrespective of what you want to continue with. So it's quite important for that public scientific literacy and engagement with science too. So within the bag, sticking with the bag metaphor, you can roughly divide science capital into 4 main areas or pockets. So there's science literacy, what you know, and that's often what we focus a lot on in school science, on the content, the knowledge and the skills. There's also the attitudes and dispositions that you have, so how you think about science. Then there's what you do out of school, science behaviours. So do you go to the lovely Glasgow Science Centre? Do you look up science online, talk to people at home about it, and so on? And also, who do you know? Do parents have science qualifications? Do you have family friends, science networks? So in the project, we were predominantly working in the context of science and talking about science capital. But more recently, we've become much more interested in STEM more generally, and also the question of, does science capital relate to STEM capital, or is it just specific to science? So these are analyses that we're literally doing at the moment, so they haven't been published yet. But we found that science capital does significantly relate to wider areas of STEM capital. So it relates very strongly to engineering attitudes and aspirations. It relates, but less strongly to technology, attitudes and aspirations, and it relates to attitudes to maths, but not aspirations in maths. And within science participation, it's particularly strongly related to physics. So the way we understand science capital is we draw on the sociological work of Pierre Bourdieu, who is a sociologist particularly from the 1960s in France. And being a sociologist, we have to give it impenetrable jargon. Nothing can be simply named, but once we work with and beyond that, we find it quite useful. So Bourdieu suggested that we can understand inequalities in education and in social life through the interplay of what he calls habitus, capital, and field. So habitus is like your feel for the game. It's how you're socialised. It's all those taken for granted dispositions that you have through home and school about what's normal for people like me. Your capital is your resources. So for Bourdieu, this was all about going to the opera and doing things that are very arts related. We've extended that by incorporating science capital. But this is like the hand you have to play in the game, your resources. And all of this takes place within the setting of the field. So for Bourdieu, field is more than just context. It's about the power relations within a context. And field is what sets the rules of the game, and field determines the value of your capital. So we find field, I'm going to expand a bit more on why we think field's useful for understanding this further. But in sum, it's the extent of the fit that you find between your habitus, your capital, and the field that determines whether or not you're experiencing science as something that's for me or not. So if you've got a lot of science resource, you've been brought up in a way that's very comfortable with science, when you're in the science classroom, you're much more likely to feel that science is for me. So just to unpick that slightly, as I said, habitus, this notion of socialisation over time. So we do this all the time. We've got kids in the study who, will talk about, oh, my family always say you're really good with children, I do lots of babysitting, and they end up aspiring to nurturing careers and so on. So in the context of science, it's very powerful for producing that notion of, I feel like a science person. So there's just a couple of differences here that I was going to share from a couple of families in the study. So the first one is a high science capital family. And as you can see, the mum was, in her interviews, talking about, well, the other day in the car, we were laughing about chemical symbols and things. So I guess it comes into discussion quite subliminally. Now, I'm sure everyone here definitely laughs about chemical symbols every day in the car. But in some families, this is the fabric of the family. This is daily life. And Davina are from a very sciencey family as well. Science is just where it's at in my family. And she talks about how her and her family wear their science T-shirts. They talk about the science they've read in New Scientist around the dinner room table. Science is everywhere in these families, but they're not the majority. Most of the families in our study were more like the bottom two quotes, where the mum's saying, well, I suppose in everyday life, you don't get much to do with science. So they can't see it. The science families will see science everywhere. It's in the room, it's everywhere. These families don't. Or Jack's family, he's saying about his family, they never talk about science. So these interact with the field, and it very much depends what sort of setting you're in as to how much we can open up or close down your likelihood of being able to engage with science. And as I said, if you have a context that makes it quite difficult or means you have to be very elite to continue with science, then you're much more likely to have students who not only are stopped from doing it, but who self-select out. So just to give an example, so I pick physics, partly because we focused a lot on it, because it provides a more extreme version of the general phenomena at play. So unsurprisingly, in line with physics participation, boys were significantly more likely to name physics as their best subject, and girls were significantly more likely to name it as the hardest subject, and this doesn't tie to their attainment. But we were quite intrigued that boys report higher parental expectations than girls, and they report more teacher support. This doesn't mean their teachers are necessarily giving them more support, but they are perceiving more support than the girls. So again, that sort of interaction of the habitus and the field reinforcing. And we were also struck by looking at our age 17-18 data, that when you look at who has the most stereotypical views of scientists, they were significantly more likely to be found among A-level, advanced level physics students. So they were significantly more likely than any other young person to view scientists as odd, male, and geeky. So in a way, this raises a challenge for some of the interventions which are trying to improve engagement with science by telling the kids who don't choose science that scientists are not all odd, male, and geeky, because our data would suggest they're not the ones who predominantly think that or hold that stereotype. They see scientists as relatively normal people, albeit quite very clever. Whereas if we have a culture where it's quite hard to do that subject and you're socialised into the culture of the subject over a long time, that's what we think is happening with the advanced level physics students. And then they are more continuing the culture on further. So we looked into our data a bit more, and we were interested that the views of physics as hard and masculine were common across all the young people. So it was common across all the students, whether they took it or not, and whether they were boys or girls or not. So there's a quote from Hannah there who says, well, she's talking about physics, saying, I guess it has that connotation of manliness. Now, Hannah was the only girl in our interview sample who went on to study physics at university. So it's not that Hannah has a radically different view of physics compared to all other students. She recognises that, and she does a lot of identity work to reconcile that masculinity with her own identity and to persist in that. And as you can see there, this view is widely shared among parents as well. So Ella, a mother, saying, well, you know, science is not very girly, not very sexy, not very glamorous. So maybe she was thinking it wouldn't fit with her daughter as a career option, and being seen as geeky men, another mother there. And these views become naturalised over time, what Bourdieu would call doxa. It becomes what Davina says, it's just kind of the way it is. We stop questioning it. We just accept physics must be hard and masculine. And this can lead to this very widespread self-censorship. So in our study, the girls who self-identified as girly girls would tend not to aspire to those areas, or if they did, they'd either drop out over time or they would change their own identities. So, for example, Davina used to identify as more of a feminine girly girl, but over time, as she stuck with physics, she became much less girly, or as she put it, swears like a sailor and wears quite masculine clothes. So looking at the girls who did manage to take physics at A-level at 17, 18, they were all very distinctive. So in a sense, it gave a bit of a depressing picture because it suggests there's not this great pool of diverse girls who could be, you know, just recruited easily into physics. The girls who got there were really distinctive. As you can see, they tended to be white, South Asian, middle class. And a lot of them would talk about being proud to be different. So there's a couple of quotes there. So again, from Davina saying, well, maybe that's kind of the beauty of being someone that's good at science, I guess. The fact maybe you're not like your average person. So this notion that science, but particularly physics, is special, you have to be different, particularly if you're a young woman in it. They all attained very highly. They had high levels of science capital. The girl, Hannah, who actually went on to study physics, had the highest physics-specific capital out of any of our sample. Most of her family seemed to be astrophysicists. They had very supportive schools, which is important, whether they were single-sex or co-ed schools. Their schools were actively recruiting young women to physics. They all preferred the theoretical side. And they had a strategic approach to gender distinctiveness. So some of them would say, well, I know it's a bit cheeky, but I know that university departments need more girls in engineering or physics, so I might have a better chance. But very few of them, as I said, only Hannah actually went on to do a degree in physics. And that wasn't because the others didn't want to do it. So again, it's not a lack of interest or a lack of love of physics. So the first quote there is from Kate. So Kate said, Kate was doing A-level physics. She said, I think I've always liked physics, but always thought it was quite hard, so maybe not for me. I wouldn't do like a straight physics degree because it would be too hard. Like, I think I'm just put off by thinking that would be really hard. So you may subtly pick up Kate thinks physics is quite hard. But the point behind that is that Kate was our highest achieving student in the whole interview sample. She had straight A's and A stars across the board at GCSEs and the same at A-levels, including physics. So Kate absolutely was clever enough or attaining high enough to do physics, but she felt she couldn't. And we think this is part of the culture of physics that needs changing. Physics gets a lot of status from being seen as hard. If you have a subject that's seen as hard with strict entry criteria, it gives it status and eliteness, but it's very hard to then widen participation. And Kate opts out, she self-selects out. Davina's quote gives us a few hints as to what might be behind that. So she's saying, if someone says, do you think you're clever enough to do physics at university? I'd say definitely not, most definitely not. Like, no way could I do physics at university. And she says, I mean, I guess I'm probably smart enough to get the A-level, so to get a good grade at A-level, but I don't think that necessarily means I'm actually that good at physics, if you know what I mean. I have to work quite hard for it. So we think underlying some areas of science is this stereotype of the effortlessly brainy, brackets male, scientist, Sheldon, basically. And the idea that if you have to work hard at it, then maybe you're not good enough. And it's our young women who are questioning that of themselves a lot more. But we also have practices, as I signalled at the beginning, where physics is marked hard, where you do have to have higher qualifications to get onto it. So the fact that we make you work hard for it, but then that gets internalised as, obviously, I'm not good enough, it leads to this self-selecting out. So those are the girls that did physics, and I now want to just talk about a girl who wanted to do physics, but who didn't do it at A-level. So this is Danielle. The picture is not Danielle. The picture is purely a gratuitous shot I found by Googling it. But it exemplifies Danielle's a white, working class, self-defining, glamorous, girly girl. And she loves physics. So we tracked her again from 10 up to where she is now. And she'd always had what she called a secret wish to be a scientist, but she never felt she was good enough for it. And we think there are 3 reasons that make it difficult for Danielle to become a physicist. The first is she has, in quotes, the wrong body. So we interpret Danielle as not being discursively possible within physics. She doesn't fit the stereotype of physics. So she describes herself there as a bit of a party girl, likes hair and makeup and stuff like that. But I do like the school side. Like, everyone thinks I'm really dumb, but I'm not. I seem quite dumb, I suppose, because I'd like to do my hair and makeup and just seem like a blonde bimbo. Now, Danielle has a very contested relationship with cleverness the whole way across her interviews. She's always struggling over, am I clever, am I not? And how does that fit with her embodied self as a white working class young woman? And she gives an example of how she goes to a school careers fair and she wants to find the science stand, but someone comes bounding over to her and says, you look like you'd like to do hair and beauty, young woman. And Danielle feels quite affronted, like, why am I not being recognised as liking science? Why am I being stereotyped like this? But it makes it difficult for her to see herself and be seen by others as authentic. She also, for physics, arguably has, and going in quotes, the wrong mind. So Danielle does really, I would say, well at school. She gets B's and C's. She works her way up from the bottom sets at the start of secondary school. But she's not exceptional. And again, that notion of why do we demand exceptional attainment? I think B's in physics should be fine, but why the notion of physics as an elite, very brainy subject means that that's seen as somehow not okay. She talks about how all my family is not clever, and she talks about the negotiation she has at home. So there's a quote there she says about an exchange with her dad, who says that she's not clever enough to go to college, and she says, yes, I am, shut up. Like, he doesn't know I'm clever. He thinks what everyone else thinks, that I'm not clever because I look like this, but I'll prove him wrong. So she has to do a lot of identity work the whole time to struggle with and reconcile these things. And we see the notion of cleverness as very much a gendered, classed and racialised discourse that makes it very difficult. It's more difficult for particular young people to inhabit it authentically and to be seen by others in that way. And the alignment of science with cleverness is deeply problematic for us because of that. So Danielle decides that she doesn't want to take the elite, the high-status triple science route to A-level. She says, I wouldn't have done it, I'd have failed, there's no point. She self-selects out. And she's got the wrong capital as well. So she's from a working-class background, no one in her family has been to university. She likes doing bits and bobs of science outside of school, but it's never really capitalised and worked with. And she makes this private decision that she's not good enough. She does try to get onto A-level physics, but she's channeled away from it. As a BC student, it's seen as a bit of a risk because it is marked harder. And she's supported to make the right choice, which is that maybe she shouldn't try to push too hard to get onto A-level physics. And there's a quote there saying that when we have these processes there, we all too soon stop asking why. And exclusion works very powerfully through self-exclusion. I'm sometimes asked, does Danielle's story have a happy ending? And the answer is yes and no. Science-wise, not so happy. But she's gone on to do sociology as a degree, which for me is a result. So I'll welcome her in. So typically with sociology, we tend to present critique as loads of problems, but in our study, we really are committed to trying to work out what can we do about this in practice. So we wanted to take these ideas and say, well, is there anything you can do about science capital? Is it all set? Is it sort of hopeless, depressing situation? But we've worked with teachers over the last 4 years to develop a science capital teaching approach, which we think, our data suggests, is having really good outcomes. So the approach builds on its foundation of existing good practice, a good equitable teaching practice. So we're not reinventing the wheel in that respect, but it augments that through a specific science capital lens. So as you can see there, we've worked with 43 teachers over 4 years to develop it, and we've trialled it once in London with some teachers, and then once in Newcastle, York, and just outside Leeds as well. So it uses a typical professional development model where we all get together, but then we also have regular support. So in London, it's myself and my team members that would go and observe and feed back and talk about ideas for lesson plans with the teachers over the course of the year. And the year after that, with the teachers in the North, it was the National STEM Learning Centre. And we collected lots of data on it, qualitative and quantitative. This, in a nutshell, is the approach. So we're very pragmatic. It's a teaching approach. It's not resources. It works with any curriculum, which is what we wanted. It's a typical cycle of professional reflection where you reflect and you just tweak the lesson you're going to teach anyway in line with the principles of the approach, which is a foundation and 3 pillars, which I'll just explain. So the foundation is the idea of broadening what counts as science. So the idea here is that it's not just that kids struggle with the science content, it's actually we need to get their relationship with science right from the start. And that for too many young people, science feels distant, it feels abstract. So the amount of times you've sat in a class and you hear a young person go, "Science, what's the point? When am I ever going to need this?" So we're trying to work with teachers to go beyond some of what some of the teachers felt were quite traditional ways of being recognised as being good at science. So as an example of what this means comes from Karl's work in the States. And she looked at the same class of kids at different time points with their different teachers. So this is in a middle school. So in their 4th grade, the class she looked at had lovely Miss Wolfe, who was very student-centric. And for Miss Wolfe, what counted, what got you recognised as being good at science, was being curious, asking good questions. And it's the notion that we're all co-learners together, so an approach that I'm imagining is very familiar to lots of you. And in that class, these 3 sample students, Aaliyah, Amy and William, were all really engaged and they saw themselves as science people. So Aaliyah in particular thought, "I'm great." She was quite loud and like questioning and she felt she was really engaged with science there. When the same class reached 6th grade, they had Mr. Campbell, who took what could be called a more traditional approach. He was much more about the expertise and the authority of the teacher as the expert. And being scientific was about being well-behaved, copying it down, putting your hand up and getting the right answer. This didn't work for Aaliyah at all, so she disengaged. She wasn't able to be that student. It didn't fit with who she was. Amy is one of those students who does well in every subject and does school. So she did well, but she didn't see herself as scientific. She was doing school, but it's a class like any class. And William was very quiet, didn't feel good at science in that class. He couldn't get the answer right. So the notion is the context we provide can open up or close down possibilities for different children in the class as to whether they can feel scientific or not. So the first pillar beyond that is the idea of personalising and localising. So all our teachers are already brilliant at contextualising science. They all contextualise. But we wanted to go beyond that and say, well, how do we now make science personally meaningful and relevant to the particular children in that class? And it's based on Angela Calabrese Barton's notion that how can we expect children to invest and engage with education if their worldviews and identities are not recognised? So this meant that the way teachers applied the approach varied radically. The way they tweaked their lesson plans varied very much depending on who their students were. So, for example, a class that I sat in East London, where the students were particularly from Bangladeshi backgrounds, that class loved food, and whenever the teacher decided to ask them and draw on their own expertise of South Asian cooking when discussing molecules and mixing and things like that, they really engaged. They were just leaping out of their seats because they got the relevance. In Newcastle, the teachers there were using things that were more meaningful for their kids. So often it was about football beauty, Geordie Shore, but they were working with what they liked, but also their local areas. So it was very powerful when they represented their local area in the science lessons. So when they were doing about moments and forces, the teachers had gone to the kids' local playground and filmed themselves on the seesaw. And the kids couldn't believe that the teachers had been in their space and were using this, because often the contexts we give them are quite big, official, sort of well-known, rather than they were valuing the local area. In the area outside Leeds, farming and rural issues were much more resonant with the kids. But across the board, there are obviously things around the kids' hobbies, their interests, their identities, family members, expertise that they got, things that they knew about that they could draw on. And when they did, it really helped connect the science. So the second pillar was a technique that we co-developed, which is really to help that process, which is where teachers just remember to elicit what their students know already, the idea whatever you're teaching, there'll be some real-world application or relevance that they'll already know about, value that, and then link it to the science. And then the third pillar is the one that's slightly more different, which is specifically building the different dimensions of science capital. So when we've used our surveys, we've managed to unpick some of some of the areas of science capital that have the strongest relationship to whether a child aspires to continue with it and have a science identity. And some of those are things like being aware of the transferability of science. So the idea that science doesn't just lead to jobs as a scientist, a doctor or a science teacher, but actually the content and skills you get is relevant for any job. Even if you want to be a celebrity, you need to know how to problem solve and handle data and so on. So this was where teachers were really just weaving in aspects designed to build the specific dimensions of science capital through their classes across the whole year. That notion of science being everywhere, so bringing it back to the everyday the whole time, and by doing it systematically, sort of drip, drip, drip through the year, it did significantly change the kids' views and their science capital. So I've sort of whizzed through this quite quickly. If you're interested, we have the handbook, and it's online, and we have hard copies, and they're free, and we happily share them. You can download. But there are examples and lesson plans and tweaked lesson plans, examples of how the teachers that we worked with developed this and did it in their classrooms in there. There's also a little animation explaining the approach, and a short film where some of the teachers filmed in their classrooms talk about how they did it. But I'll just give you a sense now of what we found for what impact and effects it had. So this again is summarised on an infographic that's on our website, or we can send out if you want the detail. So the first thing that we found, because we implemented it over the course of a whole academic year, which was that teachers changed their practice, which for us is no mean feat, because often we all go to things and it all is great on the day, and then you go back the next day, you're in the classroom and life takes over. But as Miss Smith there exemplifies, saying that's been the best part, it really has changed how I teach. The students didn't know the content of what their teachers were doing. They knew they were doing something because they'd have people come and turn up and collect data in their classes about it. But when we asked them at the start and then at the end of the year, they would say, well, my teacher's teaching very differently to before or to other teachers. The kids would call it going off topic. It's not the label we would choose to apply to it. We think it's on topic, but that's what they'd call it. But the content of what they said they were noticing was in line with the principles of the approach. So, for example, saying she teaches you based on what you know, that valuing, the illicit value link, the valuing of home capital. She's linking science to jobs we can have, and that's interesting. So the students recognised what their teachers were doing. We did go into it not totally expecting a change in science capital, because the way we measure science capital is a composite measure, so it has lots of bits in it, so it's quite hard to change. But the two red bars show the pre and post beginning and end of the year data, and there was a significant increase in the students' science capital. We also collected, the green bar is comparison data from students in classes who weren't getting it in the same school and students in other schools that were matched to those schools. And they'd started higher, but you can see that the gap closed with them. And the yellow bar is the national average, which shows it's still below, but we deliberately wanted to work in schools with low science capital in challenging circumstances, because we feel if it can work there, it's more likely to flow up and work anywhere rather than the opposite way. But as you can see, so they started with very low science capital, and it significantly raised it in 9 months. We weren't specifically setting out to change aspirations, but we did collect an aspirations measure. And again, the red bars, there was a significant increase in the proportion of students aspiring to study one or more A-levels, science A-levels. So again, this actually sort of slightly outstripped the comparison schools there, and again, closing on the national average. This is a composite measure, so we were interested in the dispositions, the habitus, can you shift kids' habitus? And their views of the personal meaning and relevance of science significantly increased in the classes using the approach over the year as well. So that's an example of science relates to my life. Science lessons relate to my life. We weren't looking at what kids do out of school, but the out-of-school setting is really important for us. So a lot of the teachers in developing the approach specifically designed homeworks that would encourage children to talk with their parents at home, to value what science-related knowledge and skills their parents may already have in relation to whether it's cooking or carpentry or anything, and to really take science home and start those home discussions. So we did see changes in the amount of out-of-school science kids were engaging with. That's a confusing graph showing the decline in kids who say they never do it from the start to the end of the year. So there were changes in the regularity, increases in the regularity and decreases in the nevers. That's just the nevers. So that's going online, talking with others and going on a nature walk. Although the first surveys were done in the autumn, the later ones were done in the summer. So it could just be because it's nicer outside. But overall, there's a whole range of data, and just to summarise, there was increased interest and enjoyment in the lessons and increased engagement. So there's a quote there from Mr. Luca, who was saying that her Year 10 bottom set, she's one of our London teachers, so her Year 10 bottom set are a very challenging group of students, and the research team who sat in on those classes would agree they're quite lively, that bunch. But through the year, what she's noticed is when she uses the approach, you can see it in their eyes. And so she says they're like meerkats. They sort of suddenly sit up and engage and talk about it and engage more. Across the board, teachers and students felt it helped understanding, mainly, we think, because it made sense to the kids. It resonated with them. It helped them remember it more. It made them pay more attention. But it increased understanding. There was improved behaviour measures, more inclusive classroom participation of the kids at the side who don't ever speak or don't ever say anything, because as one student put it, everyone's got something to say when you use an approach like that. It's not about getting the answer right. We deliberately didn't collect a coherent attainment target, but we asked teachers to provide us with their attainment data, and there were good increases there, improved attainment. And our teachers are our best advocates. So they all found it helped them get back to teaching for the way they wanted to teach science and what they felt the meaning was in there. Get away from the sort of teaching to the test. So at the start of the year, one of our teachers said that he was doing his approach, and one of the kids put his hand up and said, "Sir, is it in the test?" And he said, "Well, no, it's not in the test." And the kid rubbed it out. So some of it was the teachers also working to change the culture of what the students were expecting in their class, expecting to be taught to the test, and shifting away from that. And they all started to share practice. They weren't required to, but they all started to share it and were asked to share it with their departments and their colleagues. So I've painted a very rosy picture, but there are obviously issues and limitations. We'd say this is still ongoing, still in process. Different teachers found it easier or harder to get to grips with it. Some of it was closer to what they were doing already, and some of it was more of a change. There were difficulties balancing with the high stakes demands of, particularly in our GCSE years, although some of our most successful examples were a teacher in York who applied it with his GCSE year and even to like revision classes. So it could work, but a lot of our teachers understandably found it more risky and worrying or harder to use in those years. There were 2 students in the study who were a bit sceptical, who said, "It's all right, I like it, but will it help me pass the test?" And there were no change in the percent aspiring to be a scientist, and a small decrease in the percent aspiring to medicine. But we're not too worried about that because, again, it's not because we're not only concerned with the pipeline, but also we think the key message is about shifting young people to keep your options open with STEM to the next step, not necessarily about aspiring to... Okay, I shall stop. And it's only focused on secondary as well, whereas the evidence is that we need primary. So, super quick, because I've run over. Our relationship to science is complex and shaped by lots of factors. We think it's key to focus on the field, not just focusing on changing the young people, but changing structures and systems and practice around that. We would like more support for educators to be able to engage with risks and inequality issues, and that no simple or one-off intervention is going to do it. We would like to shift the notion that this is a longer-term project. We've got a booklet, I won't talk to them now, but for decision makers with 5 key messages of how we think it can support both in schools and more broadly in informal science education and engagement. And there are just some do's and don'ts there, which again is part of our trying to summarise, but I would be interested in people's views on if they're helpful or not. And I'm very happy for these slides to be shared because I'm super spinning through them at the end. So that's my last one, but if you're interested, do feel free to contact us and we're happy to send you anything and to talk further later. But thank you.